Get going.
All right.
And Michael has started recording the meeting. So welcome back, everyone, to the California Fire Science Seminar Series, which is co-sponsored by UC Berkeley, or predominantly sponsored, I guess, by UC Berkeley, and co-hosted by Michael Gallner at UC Berkeley, and Jeanette Kobiana-Nikas and myself, Crystal Colden, at University of California, Merced, as well as partnership from the California Fire Science Consortium. So we appreciate all of the folks that are on board today for another great speaker. And of course, we're winding down to the end of the fall series here. We have, I believe, one more speaker this semester, and then we are working on getting our schedule set up for spring, and we'll notify everyone that is on the email list of when the Spring the Speaker series will start up again mid-January, and who our speakers will be over the course of the spring semester, whatever that may look like at your particular institution. So today, our speaker is Dr. Erica Kuligowski, who has spent many years at NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. There we go. Working on fire social science there, and recently accepted a position and moved herself to Australia. And I will let her introduce herself a little bit because I have no idea what position she's accepted there and what she's doing there now. So I'll go ahead and let her take it away. Thank you so much, Erica.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I really am very excited to be a part of the seminar series and talking with you today. So I'm excited to be speaking with you guys about household decision-making and evacuation behavior during wildfires. I am a Vice-Chancellor Senior Research Fellow in the Engineering School at RMIT University, and I'm talking to you today from Melbourne, Australia. So before we get started, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So RMIT acknowledges the people of the Wuwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. So I'd like to just start with a brief outline for the talk. I will give you guys a little bit of information about me, and then I'll get into why there is a need to study evacuation. Let's kind of start from the beginning, and then we can dive right in. So we'll talk about what problems can occur and how we mitigate negative consequences associated with the impacts of wildfire on people. Then we'll get into what does the research say about human behavior during bushfires, what are the gaps in our knowledge, and what are the current projects that I'm working on to fill some of these gaps, and then end with an idea of some ideas for a research roadmap. And I should say, you'll see bushfires on this slide, wildfires on another slide. Moving here to Australia, I tried to be as consistent as possible with my terminology, and bushfires slip through. So a little bit about me. So I have a BS and MS from the University of Maryland College Park in fire protection engineering. In the middle of my master's, I started at NIST as a fire protection engineer. And then a few years later, went back to school to get my PhD in sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where I was focusing on applying social science theory and methods to engineering disaster-related research questions. And so I graduated in 2011, and since then have considered myself to be an interdisciplinary researcher, both a fire protection engineer and a disaster sociologist. So as an FPE and a disaster sociologist at NIST over the last 18 years, I'm dating myself a little bit, I've been involved in interdisciplinary studies with engineers, social scientists, and other researchers where we're interested in understanding the hazard itself, the impacts of that hazards to buildings and infrastructure systems. And I have primarily focused on the impacts of that hazard to the people. And so I've been focusing on the decisions that people make and the actions that they take to protect themselves, as well as why they make certain decisions and take certain actions. In the last 5 to 6 years, I've primarily focused on wildfires. I was a group leader at NIST of the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Group, and at the same time started a focus studying evacuation from wildfire events. I've also worked on code committees, including one in Canada, where they were looking to establish national codes and standards. I'm also co-authoring a new chapter in our Society of Fire Protection Engineers handbook on evacuation and wildfires with Steve Gwynn and Tara McGee. So let's start from the beginning. Why is there a need to study evacuation? So I'm sure that this audience knows very well that there are places around the world, and more places as the years go by, that are experiencing extreme fire conditions. And so Crystal Colden and other experts have talked about the 3 drivers of these fires being climate change, from drought, extreme fire weather, even bark beetles, etc. People expanding into the wildland-urban interface, and fire exclusion, so the buildup of fuels due to suppression, as well as the lack of safe burning. And so from the season here in Australia, last wildfire season saw some very significant intense fires, and quite a number of bushfire inquiries were performed. And the one from New South Wales, and I quote, stated that it is clear that we should expect fire seasons like 2019, 2020, or potentially worse to happen again. And so from these fires that occur every season, about 3% of these spread to communities, potentially causing deaths and injuries. And so because of that, the goals of agencies, and I'm speaking primarily of the US, although this is true in Australia as well with their Leave Early policy. So the goal has been to evacuate households before the fire reaches the community. So when these fires occur, in a perfect world, evacuation is safe, efficient, and fast. So as far as response, in a perfect world, movement would start immediately after a warning is given, and people would move directly to safety. Also in this perfect world, every household would have a way to evacuate their community, maybe through personal vehicles, public transport, shared transport, etc. For the routes, there would be more than enough capacity on these routes. There would be no congestion in this perfect world. Emergency responders could ingress at the same time people are egressing, and everybody would use their shortest or quickest route to evacuate. And finally, the community would be fully evacuated before the fire spreads to the edge of this community. But what can occur, and in some of the most significant fires where we see some pretty significant impacts, what can occur are the negative consequences, right? So for response, we can see delayed decision-making and evacuation, or even deciding not to evacuate when conditions may warrant evacuation. We've seen last-minute evacuations of critical facilities, like the picture I'm showing on the screen of a hospital evacuation. Evacuees have encountered traffic congestion, running out of gas, having to abandon their cars, causing additional congestion on the road. And in some cases, evacuees have been slowed or overcome by fire or smoke on the routes, maybe even being trapped in vehicles or involved in accidents. And as far as the destination, there have been instances where temporary refuge areas have had to be used as a last resort. And so this is where evacuees are unable to leave an area, so they'll move to a temporary refuge area, and it's often the case, are protected by firefighters at that location. And also maybe what we've seen, shelter overcrowding, or where shelters have been unable to accommodate people with disabilities, health problems, or pets. And what can occur is these consequences can lengthen the time people will spend evacuating, potentially in harm's way, or it could even lead to deaths and injuries among residents. So why does this happen? I've put kind of the reasons, the causes in these three buckets. The first being fire or environmental conditions. So rapid fire spread increased by wind conditions, abrupt changes in fire direction, which can be very difficult to predict. In multiple ignitions over time from the same fire, mega fire behavior, especially more recently, fire jumps, fire whirls, tornadoes, even very intense localized fire weather systems. There are also kind of things we can look at related to the community's population that could potentially lead to these negative consequences. There could be vulnerable populations that may be unable or may have to take more time in an evacuation scenario. There are people who have competing responsibilities to family, work, or home. There may be people who have opposing or unfavorable perspectives on evacuation, or maybe even maybe even unfavorable perspectives about authorities or warnings provided by authorities. Some population may have a lower perception of risk before or during a fire event, especially for some of the more significant fire events, or may want to wait for audible or visual confirmation of cues before leaving. Some populations may be tourists or visitors, may be unaware, uncertain of the risks associated with wildfires, maybe even uncertain about the emergency procedures required. There are people, we all have a tendency to do certain things, for example, moving to the familiar routes or people before evacuating, as well as everyone's coming into these fire situations with previous experiences that may have been positive or negative related to the fire or even the evacuation itself. There are causal factors associated with the community infrastructure as well. Related to the physical infrastructure, there could be communities with limited or blocked egress routes, insufficient capacity of the routes or transit options, power losses before the fire or during the fire that may hinder communication, limited mobile phone coverage, etc. Other factors related to community infrastructure from a social standpoint, so the social infrastructure, if you will, maybe warnings are not issued or they're issued late, potentially because of some of the factors related to the fire environmental conditions that I just mentioned. There could be an uncertainty of when to warn, a fear of panic, for example, that may cause some hesitation on warning or may cause some hesitation on providing sufficient information about what's going on. There could be fear of over-warning or warning fatigue, maybe even a distrust or over-reliance in certain platforms and systems, and we can get into that in a little bit. Difficulties with coordination across agencies and officials, and potential gaps in evacuation plans. So some examples of ways to protect life and property for wildfires are also, I've kind of organized them in these three buckets, but I should say before I present them that there's lots of ongoing research being done in these areas. Great strides are being made in many of these areas. So by mentioning them, I'm not necessarily saying that the research or the work in these areas are non-existent, actually quite the opposite. So related to ways we can protect life and property from a fire environmental condition standpoint, mitigation or fuels reduction, advanced detection of the fire, improved modeling capabilities and prediction, increased firefighting capabilities and technologies, building codes and standards. Related to the community population, lots of work going on in California and around the country and the globe really on household evacuation programs, training exercises, creating vulnerable populations databases, as well as some work that can be done improving evacuation plans, emergency communication strategies and templates, increasing coverage and reliability of the power and communication systems, and shelter guidelines. What I'd like to focus on in this talk is how can we improve evacuation plans, emergency communication strategies, and templates? And mainly, how might we do these to reduce the negative consequences that I presented earlier? But before I move on, I just wanted to kind of give a background on what do we mean by evacuation planning. So typically evacuation plans include identifying who is at risk, so the high risk townships and areas in a particular region or jurisdiction, and also highlighting the evacuation procedure, so identifying and making arrangements for the protection of community members, including vulnerable populations, identifying the procedure. So what are the appropriate egress routes? Where are the shelters and places of safety? How might we move people, evacuate people who have companion animals or other type livestock even, and also warning and notification strategies. So how to warn, what to say, even what would trigger an evacuation order. So these are the things that should be included in a plan. So what am I saying is the issue then? So there are current issues that exist related to evacuation planning. I'm not focusing particularly on the US. This could be really anywhere that have bushfire or wildfire risk around the world. And I've kind of separated these current issues into two different areas. One, where evacuation plans do not exist for communities at risk. So in turn, in these situations, the procedural decisions that are made when communities have to evacuate are based on potentially best guesses or the previous experience of the decision makers. And I don't at all want to take away from the knowledge and the skills of the very highly motivated, talented, and skilled individuals working the fires and making decisions on evacuation. But when fires do occur, it could potentially be easier to have a plan to rely on rather than developing something during the event when there's so many competing responsibilities at play. So that's the first issue. The second issue are when the plans are incomplete. And so I've defined incomplete in two different ways. One is when the plans are based on optimal conditions in mind. So that means when the plans are based on these conditions where we're neglecting to ask some of the what if questions, right? Neglecting to kind of consider these what if scenarios that can really stress the plan and throw a wrench in these more optimal kind of conditions. So for example, what if a particular route is closed? What if it's blocked for some reason? What if people, the majority of the people take their familiar route? What if everyone decides to evacuate all at one time? What if only a few of our shelters are available? So these are some of the ways that we can stress the plan and think about some of these more complicated scenarios. But there's also another way that plans can be incomplete in that they may be put together based on optimal behavior, right? So with optimal behavior in mind. And this is where the evacuation procedures are based on outputs from, for example, optimization models. And these are where the outcomes are focused on the most effective evacuee movement. So with optimization models, the outcome's set, right? We know we want the fastest evacuation time or everybody to take the shortest route. And then the model with the outcome set just would suggest the human behavior that's required to meet those outcomes. And the benefit here is that you don't necessarily need to know what people will do. It's more of a mathematical problem rather than a social science problem. And these models can help with identifying optimal phasing of evacuation zones, the best routes for optimal timing or distance. But the issues are that that people don't act in optimal ways, right? Most of our models for evacuation are optimization, but if people don't act in optimal ways, then what are we really modeling? What are we really simulating? And to answer some of those what if questions I posed earlier, where the consequences can be less than optimal, descriptive models are the best ones to use. And these are the ones that simulate what people are going to do that then lead to outcomes like an evacuation time or locations of congestion. And the benefit is that they simulate a more accurate kind of conception or a more accurate idea of human behavior, especially in less than optimal conditions. But the issue is that we need a lot of behavior, a lot of data on human behavior to reach these outcomes. And that's kind of the gist of my presentation today. And these models can help us to understand how long a community will take to evacuate under specific scenarios or conditions. So these models, or I'm sorry, these clearance times that we get from these models can then be compared with fire spread times for various fire scenarios. And the idea is, with this information, we can identify a boundary or a series of boundaries for different fire types that we can draw around a community, known as a trigger buffer. So whereby once a fire crosses that boundary, again, for a particular fire scenario or set of fire scenarios, the community should then be warned to provide sufficient time for evacuation. And the concept of a trigger buffer is what I have shown on the screen here in the blue dotted line. So to calculate clearance times with using these descriptive models, we have to know a lot of different things. We need to know if a household decides to evacuate and when they make that decision, when they actually depart the household or where they're initially starting, what shelter or place of safety they choose, what mode they use to get to that place of safety, and what route they choose. And all of these are associated with the clearance time. There's a decision piece of that clearance time, and then there's the movement piece. And in this simplistic graphic, I haven't even mentioned the fact that people may not be at home when the warning is given. They may choose to leave before the warning is given. So what does T0 mean for evacuation? They may choose to take intermediate trips to pick up loved ones before moving to a place of safety. So overall, there's limited data that exists on human behavior during wildfire evacuation, especially across all of these decision points. What data do exist primarily focus on that decision phase. So let's break down the decision phase a little bit more using the protective action decision model. And this model posits that individuals engage in a decision-making process before they decide to evacuate. Normally, information-seeking behaviors occur before the decision is made, and the protective actions occur primarily after the decision is made, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So let's look at it graphically. We have an individual, and they're receiving cues from their environment. It could be smoke or flames or a warning or an idea of what other people are doing. And if we want to prompt them to evacuate, and if they decide to evacuate, they need to kind of shift their perception of safety to a perception of risk. And in order to do that, they go through a decision-making process whereby they have to receive the cues that are around them. They have to pay attention to them. They have to understand them. They have to believe them in that they are believing that there is a credible threat they need to pay attention to. They need to then personalize the risk, feel like they are personally at risk and need to do something about it. They need to feel that there is something that they can do about it and that it would minimize their risk. So that's the self-efficacy. And also they need to confirm, right, that there's something going on, that they need to do something about it. And they go through this decision-making process before they make the decision to evacuate. And at that point, once they make the decision to evacuate, they either engage in a series of protective actions, for example, preparing, warning others, helping others to evacuate in their household or otherwise, or they could take the decision, they could just start movement right away. And a lot of this could be either they've prepared before they've made the decision as a just in case, or they may evacuate right away because the conditions warrant such, right? It's become very dangerous all of a sudden and they need to leave. So based upon the fact that most of the research is focused on that decision-making period, let's dig into the research. What does it say about human behavior during wildfire, especially in the decision process? So much of the research that has been done on evacuation decision-making has been conducted in Australia and the US. The graphic I'm showing you on the screen here, it's not meant to confuse, it hopefully doesn't. The purpose here is to show that I've organized the the research and the decision-making process, again, into that protective action decision model, where you have decision-making processes, you've got the credible threat and risk assessment, and then you have the actual decision to evacuate. And the factors, right, are all surrounding these processes. And the lines into those boxes are meant to show where most of the research has taken place. And most of the research in our field has focused on predicting the actual decision itself, right? Do people decide to evacuate or not? Less so, much less research has been done on what factors prompt someone to perceive that it's a credible threat, what factors influence the perception of risk, and even less in the factors that influence people to receive the cue, pay attention to it, and make sense of it. So with that in mind, let's focus on what the research says about the factors that influence whether or not someone will decide to evacuate, or at least the likelihood that someone will decide to evacuate. And so there are pre-event factors that have been identified as influential on the decision, as well as event factors. So let's focus on the pre-event factors first. And these are some of the factors that people are bringing in to the particular scenario. So it could be something like demographics. The research has shown that women are more likely to evacuate than men. Older individuals are less likely to evacuate. People who have higher income, more likely. People with place attachment, less likely. People who have done more preparedness around their home, less likely to evacuate, more likely to stay. Dependence plays a role in evacuation. Livestock and pets play a role in staying. And then knowledge and experience also play a role as well. Now, I should say some of the factors have a plus minus, and what that means is the research has shown kind of mixed results. Some research may have shown that perceived risk, for example, has influenced the decision to evacuate. Some research may have shown that it influences the decision to stay, and some research some research may not have found a relationship between that factor and the decision. So I want to get into that a little bit later about why that might be the case. As far as the event factors, their cues can also certainly play a role in the decision to evacuate, witnessing environmental and social cues, as well as whether or not they're face-to-face or via platforms. I have a plus minus there because I've lumped a lot of different factors into one. But for example, fire and embers, actually witnessing them it's a very strong relationship with the decision to evacuate. Perceiving risk in the moment also has kind of a complicated relationship with the decision to evacuate that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then self-efficacy again has a relationship with deciding to evacuate. I want to also just mention that perceived risk can be a pre-event factor and an event factor, in that the pre-event factor has to do with how people perceive the risk in the future. Right? So how likely is it, what do I feel at risk from an event that may occur? And the perceived risk as an event factor has to do with how we perceive the risk to ourselves in a particular event. So I have not identified all of the references for these factors, but if you're interested, please take a look at the Folk et al. Article I have at the bottom of the screen, and that provides a review of a lot of this work. So, how do we go from factors that influence the evacuation decision that I just presented to evacuation planning, right? I started off with talking about the kind of inconsistencies, or maybe some of the fact that some of our plans are incomplete. So how do we go from knowing what factors influenced the decision to the evacuation planning? And this is done by linking factors with their decision points. In other words, modeling human behavior to actually predict decision points, or the likelihood of making certain decisions, and to develop submodels, right, that we can eventually incorporate into our current simulation modeling tools, which can then be used for the descriptive models to improve evacuation plans. So that's what we did. We attempted to predict risk perception and evacuation decision just a portion of that decision-making process from the PADM in the 2016 Tennessee fire. So this was a fire that occurred in Gatlinburg, Tennessee in 2016, prompting almost 14,000 people to evacuate. And so we were asking, what influenced households to take protective action or not in this fire? And can we predict decision-making of households? So I developed a 20-minute survey that we sent out to people in both evacuation and fire zones. They asked questions targeting a lot of those factors that I just mentioned in the last slide. And we were able to obtain 388 responses, which 323 were in our final sample. And we have different analyses that we performed. We ran some descriptive statistics. I will present our results from the linear and logistic regression models, but we also calibrated the wildfire decision model that I've worked on that Ruggiero Lareglio developed and that we've worked on together at NIST using hybrid choice modeling. And so that is where we were using more sophisticated modeling techniques to calibrate the WDM, where hybrid choice models allow us to incorporate latent variables like risk perception into discrete choice models. So we can talk about that a little bit later. So what did we find for our results? When we were predicting risk perception, right, through linear regression modeling, there's some interesting things that popped up, right? We weren't surprised to see that seeing flames or embers increased someone's risk perception. We were a little bit surprised actually that seeing or smelling smoke decreased risk perception. But doing some kind of digging and thinking about this within our research team, it was interesting because whereas smoke can be categorized as an intense physical cue in wildfires, the fact that the fires were burning for 5 days in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park before Gatlinburg and the surrounding areas were evacuated, this may have kind of an opposite effect. Disaster research has shown that people can become desensitized to warnings or other types of cues over a series of hazard events. So we posit that maybe the same desensitization may occur during this long-term exposure of smoke over the course of a single event because it was going on for many days. Certainly this warrants further study. Another possible explanation is that smoke may be a poor predictor of the fire front location. So especially for individuals who may be less familiar with fire dynamics, this could lead to a misconception that the fire is further away than it actually is. Some other findings that were interesting to us is that warnings from a trusted source decreased risk perception. But this actually, when we're thinking about it and looking at the research, we saw similar types of findings when I was studying the World Trade Center disaster. So because someone received a warning from a source that they found to be credible, they actually skipped the risk perception step and went right to the decision to evacuate. And that does make sense. We have kind of the negative arrow between warnings from a trusted source and risk perception, but a positive arrow between that factor and evacuation. And so if you think about receiving warnings from someone you trust, you don't necessarily have to go through the phase of feeling personally at risk to then make a decision to leave. And then prior awareness of risk had a negative relationship with level of risk perception. Going into our logistic regression, so the model to predict the evacuation decision itself, risk perception was a highly significant predictor of the evacuation decision. The same was true for gender, in that women were approximately 3 times more likely to evacuate than men. And also those who undertook fire protective actions at home before the event were approximately twice as likely to stay than those who had not undertaken those preparatory actions. And then some marginally significant findings, those with an evacuation plan, as well as those who received warnings from a trusted source, as I mentioned earlier, were more likely to evacuate. So our model predicted 86% of the decisions and also provides evidence for theories like the PADM that highlight the importance of risk perception on the decision to evacuate, right? So the importance of identifying the factors that influence each step in that process, which then influence the decision to evacuate. So our study resulted in multiple articles, the first being a NIST tech note that if you're interested on some of the descriptive statistics, please take a look at that. Our journal article that I just presented some of the findings from related to predicting risk perception and the evacuation decision, as well as 2 articles on the wildfire decision model. So that is, like I mentioned, Dr. Lovreglio's work, where it wasn't necessarily predicting the evacuation decision. This model predicts the evacuation behavioral stage. So is someone in a normal, investigating, vigilant, or evacuation stage? And so this model is, when we were looking at calibrating the model using hybrid choice, it's a sequential model. So first, the model estimates the individual's risk perception level based on the external, the individual, the environmental, the social factors. And then secondly, based upon that risk perception level for any given person, the utility model estimates the probability that the individual will engage in any of those 4 particular behavioral states. So that's an interesting way of looking at the evacuation decision, and something that kind of is a standalone submodel that once we get to the place where we're validating could potentially be something that is included in the simulation tools. So a few takeaways from our work here. The first being the challenges associated with providing timely warnings and alerts to the entire population, especially from credible sources. This work showed that a smaller proportion of participants received official warnings and an even smaller proportion from a source perceived as credible. And then some of these uncertain relationships between factors and evacuation. So fire cues, right? Embers and flames, but not smoke. Risk perception in the event, but not necessarily risk perception prior to the event. And then previous experience, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But I want to take a deep dive because a lot of the work that I've been involved in is not just evacuation modeling or data collection, but it also involves emergency communications, alerts, and warnings. So I'd like to take a deep dive into alerts and warnings, if I may. There are a number of important considerations that decision makers have to take into account when alerting and warning communities at risk. And so the first one is when to warn. So previously we were discussing when to warn, right? The trigger buffers, when a fire is getting closer or may threaten a community. So that kind of is certainly something that decision makers need to take into account when they're figuring out when to warn. But there are locations or events, for example, one that I'm showing on the screen here, where people have been warned or encouraged to leave before things get bad. And this is especially important if you know that a community will take too long to evacuate in an actual event, especially in some very dangerous fire conditions. So on the slide, a few months ago, Berkeley Hills residents were told, quote, they should stay on heightened alert, keep phones charged and nearby, and consider leaving the hills before Sunday afternoon, especially if they have trouble getting out quickly in a fire. And this was the Berkeley city officials. So this guidance in the specific event is quite similar actually to overall guidance given in Australia when we're talking about leaving early. And so this is just kind of a website snapshot from the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, where their website discusses the importance of leaving early. And what that means is leaving before the fire starts, not when you see smoke and flames. And here they're encouraging people to create kind of a plan where, based upon the fire danger rating, they have a specific kind of trigger for their household that if if the fire danger rating is at this level, this is when we're going to leave, and not to rely on official warnings even, that the bushfire can start very quickly and threaten homes within minutes. So that's interesting. I mean, we were seeing that earlier this year in California, quite similar to kind of the ongoing leave early official kind of policies in Australia. And I was kind of monitoring the Twitterverse, right, that was talking about, wait a minute, we don't normally see things like this in California. Other considerations to include when we're talking about emergency communications is what should be said, right? The message. And I consider this to be kind of the W's, if you will. So this involves the what. So what guidance are we telling people to do in a particular evacuation order? When do they need to act? And a lot of times it's now. Where, so a description of the location at risk or who should be taking action and who should not, and the why. So information on the hazard and the dangers and consequences associated with that hazard. And research has shown, social science, disaster sociology research has shown that including those elements in a warning message is crucial to prompting people to do something under imminent threat. There's a fourth W that I've kind of not mentioned, I've pulled out, right, and listed as the second bullet, and that is the source, right? Who should say it? And we know from social science research as well that people are more likely to respond if the message is provided via a credible source, right? Someone that they perceive as credible. And we can dive into that in a few slides from now. Also, how should it be said? So it's not just good enough to get the words right, the content right, but also how should it be said? The message should be specific, accurate, clear, certain. Even some research has shown the importance of delivering it with an urgent tone, right? If you're delivering it via audible or via voice. Also very important is consistency, right? So the messages across different platforms and from different sources, or even within the same source, should be consistent. There's quite a lot of research that's been done in Australia on conflicting cues and the impact that has on response. And then who are you trying to reach, right? Everyone is the hope, but you may not reach everyone if you have like populations who are less likely to receive the message. So that's important that you take into account people who may be off the grid, right, or who do not have communications technologies, people with sensory impairments or may not receive the message directly, individuals without social networks, people who may be visiting and may not have signed up for alerts, and people who may not understand the message. So here, these could be people who do not speak the primary language in which the message is being provided in, people who are cognitively impaired, visitors or those without training. So it's important to be thinking about who are the, quote, vulnerable populations, who are all the people that you're trying to reach, and how are the best ways to do that. Need some caffeine. So the next consideration is, how can you deliver the message to these populations? And the research has shown the more channels, the better, as long as the messages are consistent across channels. So platforms consist of third-party alerting systems. That seems to be the most popular in bushfire-prone areas, wildfire-prone areas. And this can provide alerts and warnings via mobile phones, landlines, and emails. Sirens even are used. The iPause system to deliver wireless emergency alerts or emergency alert services, messages, apps, weather apps, news apps, fire-related apps, media, of course, and face-to-face. So those are the things to think about, right, when we're talking about delivering and providing alerts and warnings. But here's where things can get complicated if they haven't gotten complicated already. The first is being inconsistencies, right? So there are inconsistencies in the US, for example, not to throw the US under the bus, but I'm just using that as an example, in the different levels of evacuation. So most recently, California, for example, provided guidelines that the hope is that jurisdictions across California will adopt in just providing 2 levels of evacuation, right? The first being the warning that is a potential threat to life or property. Those who require additional time to evacuate and those with pets and livestock should leave now. That is the warning. Evacuation order is the second level, and that means immediate threat to life. This is a lawful order to leave now, and the area is lawfully closed to public access. And there are other states in the US that don't necessarily use the 2 levels of evacuation. For example, they may use the 3 levels, right? Level 1, be alert. That's be alert and stay aware of the danger that exists. Evacuations are voluntary. Level 2 is be ready. Significant danger to your area, leave voluntarily or ready at a moment's notice. And 3 is leave immediately. So there are definitely differences between those 2 types of evacuation messaging, right? And so that's important because it can be very confusing if you're used to 2 levels and you go to a location where there's 3 levels. And it might not be clear that level 2 is really just a be ready, right? Where I'm used to level 2 being an evacuation order. And also some kind of previous terminology that is even being used maybe in the 3 levels that can be confusing. What does it mean to be a voluntary evacuation order? What does it mean if I have a mandatory evacuation order? And there's always the need to educate communities on these types of changes. Also, inconsistencies exist among the message content itself, right? There's only general guidelines on what to say. California, for example, has guidelines, but not a standard per se on really these are the things that need to be said in a message to prompt imminent response when evacuation is necessary. So what I've been involved in is some work with Jeanette Sutton, for example, in developing templates, because the message content can be quite difficult when we're talking about providing messages via some of the platforms that restrict the character limit, right? That restrict the character number. And these are some short message platforms like Twitter or wireless emergency alerts. So what we've started to do is design some message templates that can be used for short message alerting systems. And then Jessie Doerman, a master's student, and I was involved in her committee, she developed a short message creation tool specifically for wildfire emergencies that are just 13 prompts that a decision maker or a message provider would need to answer related to the fire or the fire scenario. And then it would spit out a 360 character maximum message for wireless emergency alerts. And these types of tools and templates can help get closer to more consistent, more efficient messages for evacuation for wildfires. Also, what's complicating matters is the varying capabilities of channels and platforms. Some platforms have a wider reach than others, right? We have opt-in systems. Everyone in California is probably aware of the difficulties associated with this, and that you have to have people sign up, and not everyone is aware that they need to sign up. Whereas opt-out systems, people need to actually opt out, and the wireless emergency alerts are an example of this. They actually have to opt out before they don't receive the messages anymore. There's also platforms that have multi-functions, some that can reach individuals with sensory impairments, for example. Also, some informal or formal social networks have wider reaches than others. So it might be that you have some champions within a community that have a wide range of social media followers. And so that would be a great way to reach a lot of people. Whereas if a community-based fire service platform may not have as wide of a reach. It's also important to understand which channels allow for to provide a message along with an alert, right? So sirens, for example, some of them don't allow for a message to be provided at all. Some of them, the message can be provided, but it's not always so easy to hear. So for communities using sirens for providing kind of an alert for wildfires, it's also important to provide the message along with it, and a consistent message, because there's too much room for people to fill in the gaps of what does a siren mean and what do I need to do in response to it. There's also channels that allow for additional information like multiple language or maps or links. But the maps, there's no kind of consistent or standard way in which we map wildfire. So that could be potentially confusing. So while some of the platforms allow for these capabilities, it's important that we think about providing this information very clear ways so that there's not kind of confusion when you're trying to clear up any confusion. There's also, as I mentioned, the platforms that restrict characters. How do we overcome some of these challenges? And that goes back to some of the goals to maybe standardize or provide some guidelines on developing messages for these types of platforms. And then some channels aren't necessarily used as much, right? And it's important to understand why. What are some of the negative perceptions associated with some of these channels? And it might be negative perceptions from the source or the message provider, or it might be negative perceptions from the receiver themselves. So an example that comes to mind here are wireless emergency alerts. So these maybe aren't as used, or definitely weren't as used a couple years ago in wildfire events. And so it's important to understand why. What are some of the obstacles associated with using those? For example, what I've gathered from talking with message providers could be a fear of overwarning, right? Just wanting to make sure that the messages are targeted to the people who are at risk. So understanding some of these negative perceptions and then working with individuals, researchers, and whatnot to overcome some of these barriers is really important. And then the source and delivery of the matter. The source and delivery also matters. People are more likely to follow guidance, advice, and orders from individuals who they perceive as most credible. For many, these are firefighters or emergency officials. For others, it could be family members, it could be champions, religious leaders, or other individuals within a particular community who are seen as credible sources. Overall, the main takeaway here is that credible sources differ community to community. And so it's good to understand which sources are perceived as credible, and if at all possible, potentially have them issue alerts or retweet or resend the alerts, or in their own way make sure that these alerts and warnings are sent on. A lack of trust in warnings is likely to increase the time before an action is taken. It's because people are wanting to confirm the information from their more trusted sources before they act upon it. And many people, research has shown that people do want to wait to receive messages in person or face to face, or maybe that's what they expect or hope, that someone's going to come and let them know that they need to evacuate. However, in fast moving fires, I'm going to just show this graphic here. I don't think you can hear the sound. It's not always possible, right? Like this is an example of a sergeant going door to door trying to help people out of harm's way, but this isn't always possible, right? And if it is possible, the downside, right, is you're putting some of these emergency officials in harm's way going door to door. So let's take a step back. How am I doing on time? Oh, geez, I'm bad on time. Let me just quickly go through what are some gaps in our knowledge. We have an incomplete understanding of the entire evacuation decision-making process. Most studies focus on the protective action, whereas not delving into some of the nuances. Some of our relationships between the factors can be really difficult to understand. I can get into that in the next hour as to why these are the case. There's very little data on decision times, and we definitely need perspectives from multiple populations. We also have quite a lack of data in evacuation movement on bushfires, right? There's a lot of choices that people make. Remember that timeline that I shared? There's a lot more choices other than just the evacuation decision. There's a lot of data provided from hurricane evacuation, right, on this, but we want to understand the applicability. Just because people do this in hurricanes, for example, prefer homes of their families over motels or shelters, or prefer to use private vehicles, or prefer familiar routes, it's important to understand if the same things occur in wildfires. So I'm working on some projects. I'm happy to talk with anyone who's staying on for the next hour, more about these projects, looking at evacuation decision making, analyzing survey data using AI, looking at evacuation using GPS data, modeling this, creating evacuation models, and even looking at emergency communications via videos, right, and images. So I just have some ideas for research roadmap. I can keep them up as we're kind of answering some questions here. I'd really be curious as to what research questions you come up with, or you came up with as you were listening to me talk. So I think I'll end my talk there, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I apologize that I went over.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I will note that we have probably time for just one question, but of course we, as always, have the additional hour of conversation from 4 to 5 Pacific time, and the link for that conversation discussion is in the chat window. So at 4 o'clock, we will go ahead and transition over to the other Zoom because this is a webinar format. It does not facilitate that sort of discussion. So again, at 4 o'clock, if you're new to this series, we'll move over to the other Zoom, and the link is in the chat. It's also in the email that you should have received if you're registered for the series.
Looking forward to that.
We'll go ahead. And let's see, we'll start with just one question. So we have a question from Will Abrams, who asks, egress routes, temporary shelters, and wildfire resource centers are often not defined or publicly communicated by jurisdictions before fires because the fire path is not certain. So what kinds of data have you found in your research to be most convincing to sway decision makers to set primary egress routes and evacuation centers before these sorts of ignitions in the WUI?
I mean,
Go ahead.
No, sorry, that's a great question. And I agree with you. Although I don't think there's any data particularly on that for wildfires, I mean, the data has shown that if people understand where they need to go and what they need to do, they're more likely to follow that information. You don't want people in the moment trying to figure these things out. Looking at maps, as I mentioned, there could be pretty confusing depending upon all the information that's provided. And so providing that information ahead of time is extremely helpful. People can use that as they're developing their own evacuation household plans. And as far as temporary or last resort shelters, I have heard the argument of not providing that information ahead of time. And I would kind of go out on a limb and personally disagree with that. I don't think by providing that information, people will stay behind and wait and go to that. If you provide them with the information of how dangerous fires can be and how dangerous it can be to wait in a temporary refuge area, the hope is that providing them with not just the hazard information, but the why, right? The consequences of what can happen in these types of events will prompt people to leave ahead of any kind of dangerous conditions so that they're not located in temporary refuge areas after the fact. But providing them with that information beforehand helps them potentially to get there faster if in fact they cannot leave with enough time. So I'm a big advocate for providing people with information up front, giving them all the information so they can make the best decisions for them before, as they're planning, and then in the moment.
Okay. And we are right at 4 o'clock, and there was actually a second portion of Will's question there. So we'll go ahead and answer that question in the discussion. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Let's give a big hand, however you can, to Dr. Kuligowski, who is very kindly joining us all the way from Australia. Gave a fantastic talk on such an important topic. The link for the other Zoom is in the chat, and then next week will be our last talk this semester. So we hope you'll join us again if you're not joining us for the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. And
so, Crystal,
Eric, I think you, yeah.
Are we able to bring these questions over because they're really great. And then I don't
Yes.
see the chat. I don't see the link. I apologize. Where am I
Have you
looking for
copied the questions, Crystal?
I have like one question left to copy.
Oh,
good.
I see the
You're
chat
doing
now.
it. Okay.
Okay, I see the chat.
Tell me when you're done before I close and
Okay,
switch.
hold
Guys,
on
I'm
a
so
sec.
sorry. I practiced this.
No,
I
it's
thought I was going to
okay.
end early, but then I just get so excited and so hopefully we'll have time.
I understand. I completely understand. Okay, I have all the questions, I think. So let's go ahead and bump over and then we'll see who joins us.